All right, Michael, thank you so much for joining me here today. Really looking forward to talking about your football career. But first, I want to take you back to the beginning of your football career. And I know you had the distinct pleasure of being the driver for Bill Walsh early on in your career. And I just want to take you back and just kind of talk to us about those car rides and just kind of your indoctrination into the NFL. Just tell us a little bit about those car rides with Coach Walsh.
Well, I think that anytime you start a job, you always start on the ground floor. And I was fortunate enough that my ground floor actually was the penthouse because I was able to drive him around. And the timing was perfect. Had I been driving him around today, we probably wouldn't even have had a conversation. He would have been on the cell phone. He would have been doing something else. But back in 1984, we didn't have satellite radio. We didn't have cell phones. We just had two people in a car and you were either going to not talk or talk. I mean, that was the choice. And unfortunately, he was comfortable enough to talk to me. And then I got brave enough, never comfortable, brave enough to ask him questions.
And what type of questions were you asking him? Was it about football in particular? Was it about team building? Like, what were those conversations like?
Well, I mean, I knew nothing. So I was a blank tape. So I was just trying to fill up the tape. I was just trying to ask him everything, why we did things, what was that, really, and then ask him about his career. Like, what would he do if he were me? What would he do if he were me again? And so I treated him like he was my father in the sense that I asked him for advice in a way to where I felt comfortable that he would offer that advice.
Yeah, and I know you've talked about Tom Peters, and I think these car rides were kind of your introduction to Tom Peters, and so it seems like it covered everything from career development to football to even like growing as a person.
Well, I think he was so well-rounded. Coach Walsh was so well-rounded. I mean, he was into the leadership, he was into all that, so it made it a conversation that was easy, and comfortable. And so when we did talk about Tom Peters or Warren Bennis or Peter Drucker, people that I had no idea who he was talking about, trust me, I knew nothing about them, that entered me into a world that I couldn't go Google them at home. I had to literally go research them. And, I was good at going to the library when you had to go to the library. I mean, I can remember in 84, 86, we drafted a player that had a steroid problem and we really didn't know anything about steroids. And so he told me to go to the library and research steroids. So I could do that. I was comfortable, going somewhere and trying to find the information, even though I didn't know anything about it.
And how did this influence your early success? Because you were with the 49ers and then you moved from there to the Cleveland Browns. And so this early part of your career, what defined that success? Was it mentors like Coach Walsh? Was it your ability to find that information? What led to your early success?
I think my early success was just being around some incredibly gifted people who shared their knowledge and wisdom. I think part of the things that if I look back on my career, I wish I would have had more patience. I should have stayed with Coach Walsh for 10 years. I believed wrongly that I needed to work for a lot of different people to learn different ways to do things. And what I learned after 35 years in the NFL, very few people really know what to do. So you're learning from people that don't know. You're better off staying with the people that do know.
Yeah, so crucial for success in coaching, just to be aligned and working under the right people.
And learning from the right people and learning from them, and you think as a naive kid coming from little town in New Jersey, you think everybody's the most talented. And I think one of the most compelling statements he made to me was the NFL isn't the best and the brightest. It isn't filled with a bunch of really top achievers. It's filled with a lot of political connections. And there lies a lot of times that you're working for somebody that perhaps isn't really the best of the best.
Yeah. Seen it in my career for sure. And I know we see that today in the NFL too. One of the things that really intrigues me about Coach Walsh is his standards of performance. And I was fortunate enough to coach with someone, Frank Gann Sr., who was a longtime NFL coach, and he had his habits that he kind of taught our teams. And so how did Coach Walsh get his team to adhere to these principles on a daily basis?
He first viewed himself as a teacher. So he taught the habits. They were always in front of us. he would have regular meetings with every department, whether it was the accounting department or whether it was the equipment staff. And he reminded them of the standard of performance. And really, if you go back to the book that I'm working on now, yeah, so the new book that I'm writing is about the Hall of Fame and about the players and the coaches in the Hall of Fame. And I think when you go back and study the great coaches and where does coaches originate from, where is the tree? There's essentially 4 trees, and Paul Brown's tree really was about the organizational methodology of the NFL, of coaching. And I think that is, and I call him in my book, I call Paul Brown the Bill Gates of the NFL. He developed the operating system, and Coach Walsh made it better. We all tend to think that an entrepreneur is somebody who has an idea that's revolutionized and becomes, but we know that, Ray Kroc didn't invent the hamburger stand. He just made it better. And that's what Coach Walsh did.
And this is actually not commonplace in the NFL, having this organizational system. A lot of times we hire defensive coordinators or offensive coordinators because they're smart with that particular aspect of the game, but it's kind of the overall view of the organization that is really critical when we're talking about success as a head coach.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to pluck somebody from one system of culture and put them into yours and think you're going to get the same results. Unless the culture's the same, it's hard. Unless the foundation's the same, it's hard. I think that's a mistake people make quite often.
Yeah. And after your time in San Francisco and Cleveland, kind of the second half of your career was really when you were a high-level executive with Oakland, Cleveland again, and in New England. And just want to hear about your growth as a leader. You talked about kind of like Bill Walsh introducing you to, all these great leadership books. Just kind of talk about your growth as a leader during that period.
Well, I think it's still going on. I think you see it as leaders, it's never complete, and I think that you just learn how to deal with people and how you and how you be able to get the best out of them. I think I learned quite a bit from Coach Walsh, watching him, and then certainly from Coach Belichick, his ability to be really calm under pressure, not overreact, handle it, diplomatically, but tell people what they needed to hear, not what they wanted to hear. And I think that's just the power of that continues to go on every single day, because you need to be able to communicate your thoughts without being in a passive aggressive mindset.
Right. And, we're in a high performance business, and obviously there's jobs on the line every single week, and that communication is key. And there's 2 aspects of Coach Belichick I'd love to ask you about. People talk about the simplicity of the system and really his ability to break down the game into very simplistic terms and teach it to players. And just want to hear from you, how did he implement this in Cleveland and in New England?
Well, I think, when you look at what he's been able to do, I mean, the simplicity of the system allows you to be complicated. If you start complicated, you can't become simple. But if you start simple, you can become complicated. And I think what he does is he starts with a simple foundation. And then every week within the simple foundation, he becomes complex, because his roots and his foundation are simple. And that's all great organizations are, is they're adaptive to the situation and they become complicated from a continual basis. But their core, who they believe in, is fairly simple. They have core principles, but yet they look complex. Apple's not a complex company. They know who they are. They produce complex things, but they're not complicated. And I think that's the brilliance of Belichick. It's the ability to be simplistic within the ability to be complicated. But it starts with simplicity, starts with foundation, it starts with fundamentals and basics.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times in football, especially, we want to complicate things. We want to show off how smart we are. But this foundational aspect is really one of the keys to their success. And also, I've heard a lot about Coach Belichick being able to admit his mistakes to the team and being vulnerable. And I just want to hear from you, like, what effect that has on the coach culture overall, and just his ability to show that vulnerability to the team.
And not only does it show vulnerability, it shows accountability. I mean, he's not passing the buck. He's not passing the buck. I mean, he shows the ability to take responsibility for the actions of the team. He will never, ever say to the team, we played bad, but I coached great. He'll always say, we played poorly. I coached poorly. He looks at it as if he didn't prepare the team. And for me, I felt the same way working for Coach Walsh. I didn't think Coach Walsh could make a bad decision. I could only give him bad information. And so if I gave him the wrong information, then he could make a bad decision. But if I gave him the right, he would make the right call.
Yeah. So crucial. And we see this in all great leaders, even outside of sports, is just this ability to, like you said, the accountability factor, and holding yourself accountable too, and not being afraid to attack problems, even if that problem is yourself or a decision.
Right. You need to be honest with yourself. Like today, I wrote for the Daily Coach, the problem with the New York Football Giants. I mean, their accountability is that they feel like they don't have accountability. They keep their structure in place, and they throw deck chairs off the Titanic. They won't ever honestly admit to themselves what they need. And I wasn't trying to be overly critical, but I think what I tried to write about is this concept of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, where when it becomes the third generation of a family-run business, there's so many people within that business that they only really know one way to do that business, because you've hired all family members who've only been trained in that business. And so therefore you can't generate new ideas. And one of Coach Walsh's favorite lines, if we're all thinking alike, no one's thinking. And that's what happens.
Yeah. And how can leaders prevent this from happening? Surrounding yourself with yes men, or surrounding yourself with people that are just going to tell you what you want to hear versus what you need to hear.
Challenge people to tell you that. Like, Belichick's very much aware that people will tell him what he wants to hear. Go and find people that'll tell you what you need to hear. Get people around you, and I think that's really important. And I think that you can't look. Belichick's smart enough to know when he doesn't need praise. He knows when it's good. He knows when it's bad. So if you're not going to tell him when it's bad, then you're going to lose credibility with him.
Yeah. I mean, that's what we need as leaders. And if we're going to be a winning team or perform at the highest level, we need that information. I mean, that is so crucial. And you had this unique opportunity to not only work with him in Cleveland, but also in New England, and talk about his evolution as a leader. Because we all know how it ended in Cleveland. And obviously we know the success he's had now. And just from your point of view, how did he evolve and adapt as a leader?
Well, I think he's the same guy in Cleveland. I think he's outstanding. I thought he was great in Cleveland. I think the situation was different. I think there was a lot of extenuating circumstances within Cleveland, the Bernie Kosar, the owner, there was some of that. But I think that once he was able to get an organization really where he felt most comfortable, where he was able to build it the way he wanted it, in the vein that he wanted, where he could really instill the Patriot way, which started the Browns way, and build it completely without interference, and he was going to be successful. There was never a doubt in my mind he was going to be successful. And people can say, well, he had Tom Brady. Well, Tom Brady wasn't a 6th-round pick because he was the greatest college player in the history of football. Okay. Like, let's put that in perspective. And, he probably was overlooked, that he shouldn't have been a 6, but he was never going to be a 1. And the combination, it's funny. The first Super Bowl they won, they beat the greatest show on turf. The last Super Bowl they won together, they held the opponent to 3 points. You figure it out.
Yeah. No. And one of the key things that I think a lot of people overlook is the ability to get those leaders on the team when he took over in alignment with the culture he was trying to build. And I've heard from different people talking about how Teddy Bruschi and Willie McGinnis were really core to getting that alignment of the entire locker room. And so it goes further than just one player or hitting on a draft pick.
And we didn't have that in Cleveland. he couldn't get that buy-in, whether it was from Michael Dean Perry, Webster Slaughter, Reggie Langhorne. There was a lot of discontent, because he was changing the culture, and some of those players were successful, and they've had their way about doing the culture the way they wanted to do it. And so that became a fight. And when a players can sing a sad song, it'll make the media happy.
Yeah, that's what they're looking for.
Right.
And how did he get this alignment with kind of those core pieces in New England?
I think he had his best players set the tone of intolerance, right? So he had Bruschi, he had McGinnis, he had Brady, who was a young player, right? He had guys that he built the team around that were really good culture players. Logan Mankins, Matt Light, drafted Matt Light. These are guys that understood what it took to work hard, understood the sacrifices that you had to make. It's like I wrote about this last week with, in August 12th, 1962, President Kennedy was on the campus of Rice, and he gave a great speech where he said, why go to the moon? We choose to go to the moon because it's hard, not because it's easy. And Belichick was able to collect players that understood the reason we play in the NFL is because it's hard, not because it's easy.
And this is a perfect segue into kind of like the team building that I wanted to talk to you about, which, a lot of times we think about team building as collecting talent, right? Like we get obsessed with the combine and arm strength or numbers or stats. But there's also like this other piece of finding the right players, either that are fit the culture the right way, or that have that certain intangible that you just kind of mentioned. Talk about how the best teams, the best coaches are able to kind of look deeper than what's on the surface and kind of find out about those players.
I think you've got to find players that are willing to have mental toughness, right? Like, let's take Ben Simmons, the 76er basketball player, okay, who's demanding he get traded. He won't show up. Meanwhile, he holds no accountability for his inability to play well in big games. LSU did not go weren't one of the best 64 teams. No accountability for that. He won't play in the fourth quarter of any big game. No accountability for that. Well, what does that tell you? He's really not mentally tough. He's not willing to do what's maybe not good for him, but it's good for the team. And when you start team building, you better find players that are willing to do what's right for the team that may not be right for them. They have mental toughness. You better find players with mental toughness. Now, you need talent. There's no doubt. You need talent. But you need mental toughness, and you need certain positions that you have to have and you can't compromise on. You've got to have a left tackle. You've got to have the ability to have a right tackle. You've got to have a quarterback. There's things that are non-negotiable. But when you pick the quarterback better be the guy that represents all those things you want.
Right. And I know it was written about in Patriot Reign about Tom Brady being energized by competition. And were there ways in your career that you saw or that you used to measure, I guess, for lack of a better term, the growth mindset of some of these players? I know that's kind of a newer term and idea in coaching, but was there anything that you guys were doing in terms of character assessment?
Oh, that's the hardest part about it, Evan, is the character assessment. We can all watch the tape. Character assessment's really hard. And I think that, what you have to do is dig deep into his background and ask specific questions. And you've got to be willing to say, hey, what was, in high school, what was your greatest achievement? Well, if this kid says, well, when I won player of the week, and doesn't talk about the wins or beating a great team, then he's about himself. I think you got to really kind of peel back the layers and see what sacrifices, past performance will predict future achievement. So I think you got to do a good job on that. And you just need to bring players in that fit the culture. If I were to call Bill on the phone and say, this guy fits the program, we both know what we mean by that. If this guy's not a program guy, we know what that means too. So scouting is about, and team building is really about building inside out, not outside in. You've got to be willing to build inside. You've got to know what you're looking for before you go out to go find it.
Right. And when we're looking at this, measuring these things, this really comes from either conversations with that player in particular or with their teammates as a way to find out about that particular player. There's no easy personality assessment that we can take. There's no easy route to find this. The reason why nobody or very few do it is because it does take kind of like that extra that extra legwork.
No doubt. And you've got to be willing to ask hard questions, right? You've got to be willing to confront the player. Like, why did you do this in this situation? What were you thinking here? What was your reason for doing it? I think you got to really dig deep into that. And if you don't, you're going to make the same mistakes because it's harder to train. It's harder to retrain than it is to train. So you want players that are willing to be trained. Look, it's not easy. 175 men and women get to become Navy SEALs. Only 30 of them make it. And the Navy has put billions of dollars into their recruitment, to their selection process. They spent a lot of money on that. However, they can't get that right because they can't really measure what happens when volume sets in. What happens when 15 days of doing the same thing? They can tell you at the SEALs program, the first day, they'll tell you who's probably not going to make it. And it's always the guy who's first in line. It's always the guy runs the fastest, the best athlete, who wants to show off early. He wants to show off all his skills because what happens is they just can't do it every single day. Team building is about finding people who will do it every day.
Right. And I think I've heard you talk about this too in your book. You talk about superb system guys versus just star players. And it just so happens that a lot of these superb system guys were also Hall of Fame players that you had the chance to work with. And this is kind of what you're speaking to.
Right. So it's what Walsh used to always say is, we'll teach the player the system, then we'll develop the skills within the system. Well, once we know the player fits the system, his skills will magnify. They'll shine the brightest. It's when we try to fit a player into the system that doesn't fit, just doesn't work. He just doesn't. That's why scouting inside out. Look, the FBI doesn't start hunting serial killers by looking in the phone book. They have a profile, what they're looking for. It's the same thing. Scouting is about elimination. So eliminate what you don't want. Get those people out. Don't sit there and say, well, we shouldn't eliminate. No, he doesn't fit the criteria. Or she doesn't fit the criteria.
Right. And I know you talk about this a lot on your podcast, the GM Shuffle, just about kind of, obviously quarterbacks get a lot of top billing and rightfully so. They're the most important player on the field. And I think as I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking about that as well, right? Like the inability to overlook kind of like the maybe glaring personality traits or character flaws, but because somebody has some skills or they did something in college, we kind of like make excuses for them. What ways can coaches or teams kind of like use to prevent this? Is it kind of a group collective that's all understanding of the culture that you're trying to build?
I think what you must do is you must be willing to believe a player when he shows him who he is. He or she shows you who he is. Don't make excuses. Ben Simmons has showed the 76ers who he is. Why do you want him back on the team? Why do you want him back on the team? Why do you want him back? He's already showed he's not going to compete. He's already showed he's not going to do the things you want him to do. He's already showed you he's not mentally tough. You better believe him. If you think you're going to change him, there's going to be that's when you get your butt fired. Believe exactly. It when a player shows you who he is, believe him.
Yeah. And it's like this idea of like, well, Ben Simmons is one of the top 20 players in the league. So let's just like throw them all together. And as you're saying, like, it doesn't work like that. And it's going to erode whatever culture that you've built up over that time.
You're just wasting your time coaching.
Yeah.
You're wasting your time because you're just the end. I already know what the end is. He's already told you what the end is.
Yes.
So,
which is where we are. But, I think like the 1980 U.S. hockey team, Herb Brooks was very intentional about finding the right players versus just grabbing the best 25 players.
Because Herb Brooks knew that to beat the Russians, it would take a team. It wasn't going to take time. It wasn't going to take one player. It was going to take a true team, guys that were willing to sacrifice for the good of the team and do the little things that we needed to do. And he knew that the chances of winning were probably 15 to 20%, but they had to do it perfectly. And that's what he did.
Yeah. Put his guys in position and like you said, built that team the right way. And like when we're talking about something like that, the word that comes to mind for me is resiliency. And you talked about it earlier in terms of like the mental toughness and doing what's right for the team, even though it may not be right for you. How can those teams build resiliency? Is it specific to acquiring those resilient players, or does it have more to do with like the head coach and his or her behaviors?
I think, well, the head coach will, the team will always assume the head coach's personality. That's a fact. And if your head coach doesn't have that resiliency in it, then it won't. I always tell the story, people love Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule. And I think it's perfect. I think we all need to train 10,000 hours in whatever we do. But I think he stopped short. I think it's one thing to train 10,000 hours. It's another thing to then have the passion to do it after 10,000 hours, and so if you go see and I call this the born to run theory, because I love Bruce Springsteen. I'm obsessed with him, but he's probably played Born to Run 3,000 times in his life. Okay. Just in concert. And if you heard him play it the first time or the 3,000th time, it's the same thing, the same passion. So what he's been able to do is keep his passion at the highest level on something that is really, really boring to him, that he doesn't need he could probably do it in his sleep, but he brings it night after night because he loves it. That to me completes the 10,000 hour rule. That's exactly what you have to have. If you don't have that in coaching, if you get Belichick's preparation for a bad team is the same as it's for a Super Bowl. And if you don't have that, you're going to lose.
Exactly. You have to take the same preparation for week one of the preseason as you would if you get into the playoffs. So you're setting the tone for your entire season. And like you're saying, this is how you do things. Right. It's not about who we're playing this week or where we are in the schedule. This is how we operate every single day, back to Coach Walsh's standards of performance.
That's right. And what you just said there, every single day, that's hard for people because they get bored. It's hard for people because they get bored. It's hard to do it every single day. I need a day off. I need time away. Well, the great ones don't.
Right. And well, I was going to ask you, you had made a comment about, culture is a plant and having to nurture it every day. And I guess we're kind of talking about that really that idea, right? Like the idea that, your culture is how you show up every day. And if you take a day off, that is a day that you don't improve your culture, that is letting it slip. And so just kind of talk about how those coaches nurture that culture every day.
Well, you got to stay on top of it because you're always it's like your children. They're always going to try to challenge you to see what they can get away with, and if you let one thing slip, you're going to let something else slip. You have to be the curator and the maintainer of culture, laying the foundation. And if you slip, if you decide to break the culture, then all of a sudden you're now, you're going to start to sink. Why does, when Jimmy Johnson leaves the Cowboys and Barry Switzer takes over, Barry wins a Super Bowl, but yet the longer he stays, the worse it gets. Why? Because he doesn't maintain the culture. The first year he didn't have to do much. Second and third year he did. He didn't even understand what he needed to maintain. That's right. A hard thing to people to do.
Yeah, no question. And this kind of ties into my next question about like the advanced levels of leadership, which I kind of like put, being a head coach of an NFL organization, a multi-billion-dollar organization, like what questions should we be asking ourselves as leaders or head coaches or leading any organization?
I think the number one question we have to get to is the right question, right? Why do we win? Why do we lose? Right. And you better answer that one right. You better not just blame it on somebody else or blame it on the referees. It's a real simple question. Why did we win? Why did we lose? And you better answer that one right. And if you don't answer that one right, your organization's going down the tubes. And it's the same thing for anybody who listens to this podcast that's not a coach. Why did we win? Why did we have a good quarter? Why didn't we? And if you want to blame the sales guy in Tennessee, then that's fine. But that's really not the root of the problem. If John Mara wants to blame the coach of the Giants' failures the last 2 years, or if you want to blame Dave Gettleman, but it's deeper than that. It's deeper than that.
Yeah. And I love what you just said. I've heard you say it before. And I totally agree. It was really striking to me. I coached for 10 years before I got to a place at UCLA where we did an after action review after every game, where we actually tried to dissect what happened. Like, why did we lose? Why did we win? Who did they do? Did our strategy match what the opponent did? Who disappointed on our team?
Did we practice it? Were we prepared?
Exactly.
Were we prepared to play? Did we practice what happened in the game? Were we caught by surprise? You know, it's like every week you got to ask yourself, why did I screw up in something I did? What was wrong with my preparation?
Yeah. And you've talked also in your book about these projects that I think you did a lot of when you were working with the Patriots this last time. Yeah. And I'd love to, and I know in your book, you outline how in the 2014 playoffs, you had kind of like given the outline for what you thought was going to be a winning formula to win. And obviously that team was able to win a Super Bowl. I'm just curious if there's any other projects kind of in line with what we're talking about in terms of like looking at organizations that were doing it the right way or wrong way, or just any projects that come to mind that you were able to kind of like have implemented after the fact.
You know, I think you always should study your competitors and figure out what they're doing. That doesn't mean you steal from them. It just means you've got to figure out what are they working on to try that you can borrow. You know, because you look, I say this all the time, you know, and if you and I were to go online today, we could get every one of Emeril Lagasse's recipes. We could print them out, and we could go rent in your town that you live in. We could rent a space and we could open up a restaurant with all his recipes. We'd be out of business in 3 months because we can't cook it like he cooks it. So you can't steal a recipe. You can't steal an idea. You have to understand the idea. Coach Walsh hated he called them play stealers, copycats, because they would steal somebody else's play because it looked good. But you don't know how the play works or why it works or why could it fail. So I think you have to really you take ideas, let them germinate in your head, and then how does it apply to what we're doing? How can we take that idea and make it apply? That's a hard thing.
Yeah, no question. This goes back to what you mentioned earlier, you know, New England kind of making everything very simple to start and then making it complex as it grows. You can't just take a play that you're seeing in week 14. You have no idea what the foundation is or why they're running that play.
Right. And that's what goes a little bit into analytics. When analytics says you should run the ball here and you don't equate to what is here. Right? You don't have anything into it, right? You just say, well, they run the ball here. Well, but you don't even know what's happened to get to here.
Right. Right. You know, it's definitely a great tool to help us make decisions, but it doesn't make the decision for us.
Right. We're in the information business, so we have to look at all the analytics. That's important. But we have to understand it in the context too.
Correct. And I want to talk about your writing now because, you know, after your career in football, now you've kind of transitioned and you're obviously doing podcasting. You've written a book. I know you mentioned you're writing another book and you write for the Daily Coach right now. So I want to hear from you just going from football to writing. What makes writing so meaningful to you?
Well, I think it's the creative process. It's being aware. It's being alive. So you see something, you know, you have a conversation with somebody, and that'll make a good daily coach, and then you go write it, you know, and it keeps your awareness at a high point. And or you see something about, you want to write something about for the book. I think it helps your creative process the best. And by writing every day, you become a better writer, which I need to be. And you become a more aware person about your surroundings and about, how would you describe the room that you're in with, the file cabinets and the sun coming through the window behind you, like you become more aware of your surroundings.
Yeah. And I'm familiar with Julia Cameron, who talks a lot about kind of like this building this creativity within yourself. Is there anybody like that, or any type of resources, or anybody you turn to for help writing?
No, but I would like, who did you just mention? I'll go look that up. I'm always looking for more help.
Julia Cameron, The Artist's Way. I'll send it to you after this.
Okay. No, I mean, I try to read a lot of newsletters. I try to read a lot of different people. I think Daniel Pink is really good at what he does. I read his stuff. I try to get as much information as I can to kind of help myself to get ideas, and like what does, and then, I wrote a piece for the Daily Coach about Ted Lasso, and, just because, how does Ted Lasso help leadership? Well, people get it. I think it's part of what we have to do is explain something complex simply. And when you can use analogies, or you can use Ted Lasso, people get it quicker.
Yeah. The stories is what connects everybody.
It really is. It's why Amazon hates PowerPoint, because Amazon wants you to be able to tell a story.
Yes. Yeah. And Amazon famous for having to write a brief before you attend the meeting, or they spend their first 15 minutes of their meetings reading. And Coach, I just want to say, like, really enjoy your writing. I read the newsletter every day. And so you're definitely helping people grow. You're definitely helping educate people. So I just want to give you a heartfelt thank you.
Of all the things I've accomplished in my career, working with Coach Raveling, George Raveling, working with Alec, who was our president, and Kamadi and Trevor, the 5 people that we work on the Daily Coach, has been the greatest thing ever. And we found a rhythm. I think the thing that we've also found is a formula. We know what people like to read in the morning. And I think when we write to that formula, we become better at writing.
Yeah, it's great. You guys mix it up every couple of days, and just absolutely love it. I would encourage everybody out there to definitely check out the Daily Coach. And Michael, I really appreciate you taking the time. Last question here, and your wife Millie, who is the wife of a former NFL executive and now the mother of 2 coaches. And so I just want to hear, was Millie always a football fan, or is she indifferent to the Gridiron Geniuses in the house?
I think she had no choice. I mean, I think it was, yes, she was always a sports fan. Yes, she was always a football fan, but, she's made a lot of sacrifices in her life to allow me to do what I needed to do. And now she gets to enjoy her grandkids, and she gets to root for her sons, but also, know that, their careers are in their own hands. So yeah, it's a good experience. It's better to have this career as a grandfather and a grandmother than it is as a father and a mother, because you're worried about your next paycheck all the time. Now I'm not as worried about it. I already paid for college.
Not as much pressure, for sure.
No, exactly. Now, yeah, I'm playing with, yeah.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining me here today. This was really a pleasure for me to get to chat with you and nerd out on some NFL team building stuff. And just thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
I appreciate it. Good conversation. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.